This is Outrageous History. Hi, I'm Ernest Granson, and this is Outrageous History. The early 1970s were the glamour days for the automobile industry. Muscle cars with brute power, luxury vehicles that could accommodate cocktail parties, elephantine station wagons that could transport whole baseball teams. Some of the designers, engineers, and promoters were just as recognizable as the vehicles they'd helped to develop. And one of the highest profile automotive entrepreneurs of that period was Malcolm Bricklin, whose attempt to cash in on the performance car market ended in bankruptcy. But there was more to Bricklin's seemingly brash quest to revolutionize that automotive sector than just designing a competitor to General Motors' Corvette. It was also his somewhat surprising arrangement to build a vehicle in the province of New Brunswick, of all places. It was the province's young premier, Richard Hatfield, who greased the wheels, so to speak, for that joint venture. Why would a Canadian maritime province toss millions of dollars at what to some people seemed a pipe dream? Dimitry Anastakis is the L.R. Wilson and R.J. Curry Chair in Canadian Business History at the University of Toronto's Department of History and Rotman School of Management. Dimitri's researching and writing a history of the Bricklin automobile, and he's with us today to talk about this unique situation. Glad to have you here today, Dimitry.
Great to be here, Ernest. Great to be here.
So, Dimitry, your research covers Malcolm Bricklin's history as a very successful businessman and automotive mover and shaker, but you're also examining this magnetic appeal of that automobile and how it fed into the entangled involvement of a provincial government. So what was behind all of that?
Well, you really have two kind of influences and factors here that are shaping a really interesting story. And the book, which I hope to finish soon, is called Dream Car. Malcolm Bricklin, his fantastic safety vehicle one and the end of industrial modernity, because it really speaks to a moment. And the first influence of the two influences is obviously the car itself. I mean, if you want to ask why anybody would put money behind a vehicle, you just look at the prototype that Malcolm Bricklin developed and the idea behind the prototype. This was a really sexy, sleek, cool sports car at a time, as you've already described, Ernest, in the early 1970s, where sports cars were a huge part of the market. You had all kinds of new Japanese competitors coming in, the RX-7 and the Toyota Celica in the early 1970s. At the same time, in the 60s, there'd been this boom in sports cars. The Mustang appears in 1964-65. You've got the Charger and the Challenger. So Malcolm Bricklin, who was a young automotive entrepreneur, he was a guy who had brought Subaru to North America in the late 1960s, saw a wicked opportunity to establish himself like a mid-century Henry Ford or Walter Chrysler, where he was going to be this kind of Horatio Alger entrepreneur, build his own car company and change the world. And he has this idea for a car, which is a sports car. But the angle that Malcolm Bricklin takes is that not just is it a great looking sports car, it also had this innovative idea of being a safety sports car. In the 1960s, Ralph Nader had revolutionized the automobile industry by forcing the big three to build safer vehicles. And a lot of consumers in the early 1970s were still very interested in having sports cars, but they also thought about making sure that their vehicles were safe too. So Bricklin comes up with this idea of a car that is got, better bumpers, it's got a roll cage, it's got all kinds of safety features, along with a plastic shell, which was a lot different than most cars, which were steel and painted. It had gull-wing doors. So it looked fantastic, but it also had the idea of being safe. And Bricklin kind of went across North America looking for places to build his vehicle. And he comes to Canada because in the 1960s and the 1970s in Canada, there was a lot of willingness by governments to support this kind of venture. So people don't remember this or don't know this, but in the 1960s, Nova Scotia had given Volvo all kinds of money to come and build the very first Volvo plant outside of Sweden was built in Halifax. Nova Scotia had also given money to Toyota. A lot of people don't know that Toyota was putting together vehicles in Sydney, Nova Scotia in the late 1960s. So there was all kinds of ventures like this where governments were willing to put money towards this because the automotive industry was still the kind of industry of dreams. If you could build cars, it meant that you were at the top level of industrial maturity. You know, in the post-war period, you've got countries like Germany and Japan, which are rebuilding themselves and reasserting themselves and emerging on the world stage as major players. Because by the 1960s and 1970s, you know, VW and Toyota and Honda and BMW are all major players in the world. So automotive manufacturing is seen as being kind of like the be-all, end-all for a country. And the same thing is happening in the 1970s, where a country like Korea is starting to build cars. Hyundai starts to build cars in the 1970s. So all around the world, you've got politicians and planners who are saying, I want to build cars. I want to support my province or region or country to build cars because it's going to be a huge boost to the economy. It'll add all kinds of jobs. It'll make us wealthy. It'll make us powerful. And that's the other side of the story, where you have a premier, a young premier by the name of Richard Hatfield, who's elected as like a 37-year-old. I think he was very young in his 30s, just like Malcolm Bricklin was only 35 in 1974 when they launched the Bricklin. And he wants to achieve the dream too. So Malcolm Bricklin's got his dream car idea of building a sexy sports car, which is also safe. And Richard Hatfield has his dream where he wants to turn his province. New Brunswick is seen as kind of a economic backwater where it's just hewers of wood and drawers of water. He wants to turn his province into the province of manufacturing and high tech, which is automobiles, and the future. And the car industry has always been identified with the future because it's new, it's technology, it's mobility, it's speed, and all these things. So these two influences come together. And in the early 1970s, in 1973, Malcolm Bricklin, he comes to Canada originally and he says, hey, does anybody want to invest in my car company? And a couple of people in Ottawa say, well, why don't you go to Quebec? And he goes to Quebec first. And the Quebec government says, well, you know what? We're not that interested, and the deal that you're offering is not that good. And we're already supporting. Renault had a plant in just outside of Montreal. So they were already kind of like helping out. But then somebody in Montreal says, well, and somebody in Ottawa says, well, why don't you go over to New Brunswick? There's a guy by the name of Richard Hatfield. And they go and they have a meeting in 1973. And Malcolm Bricklin says to Richard Hatfield, I got this idea for a car. And Richard Hatfield says to Malcolm Bricklin, this sounds fantastic. We're going to support you, and we're going to put a bunch of provincial money into this. And we're going to try to achieve this goal of building a safety sports car in, of all places, New Brunswick, Canada.
Hatfield was actually putting a lot of his career on the line, even at that early stage. I mean, he when the province and Bricklin signed their deal, that included, from the material I've seen, in the province kicking in about $5 million, a building for the factory, and factory wage subsidization. So, and then he hung much of the 1974 provincial election on that deal, and he won the election. And there in the press, it was called the Bricklin election.
It was called the Bricklin election. Malcolm actually gets a prototype. Malcolm gives Richard Hatfield a prototype, which he drives around the province during the election, saying, you know, vote for me, and this is the future that you can see New Brunswick having. So it's referred to as the Bricklin election. They put Malcolm front and center. Hatfield goes around the province. He stakes a lot of his political career on this, and this is his second election. This is actually his second election, and he wins. And Malcolm Bricklin is at the celebratory party the night of the election, and Hatfield has said, yes, we're going to commit. And initially it's $5 million. You're right, Ernest, but eventually it's about $23 or $24 million that the province puts in. They end up getting about an ownership share of about 67% of the manufacturing side of Bricklin. There was a whole bunch of different aspects of Bricklin. There was a distribution side, and Malcolm owned a certain part of it. And you're absolutely right. They give Malcolm not just one, but two facilities. There's a assembly plant in St. John's, and there's a parts plant in Minto. And they try to arrange a deal so that they're going to get even cheaper rail rates to get the cars out. They try to cut a deal with the federal government to give even more loans and money. So this is a really an intensively government-supported idea. And at the beginning, things are going pretty well. When the car first appears in 1974, Bricklin goes on a whirlwind tour of promotion across North America, and he becomes famous. He's on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. The car appears on The Price is Right. It appears on shows like Chico and the Man, which was one of the highest rated television shows. He's interviewed in People magazine and Playboy magazine all across North America. And the car is really well received. It's on the cover of Car and Driver, Road and Track. It gets all kinds of great reviews, and people are very much looking forward to this. And eventually, in the fall of 1974, they start getting into production and they start building. And it's a slow going process, but eventually they start actually building cars. And these cars are a little bit different in the sense that, Bricklin is not building the entirety of the car. He doesn't have the technological capability to build engines. So he buys his engines from Ford, and then he buys his engines from Chrysler, but he's able to build the chassis and uses kind of innovative ideas around the skin of the car. One of the things that Bricklin does, besides the gull wing doors, which is pretty innovative and stylish, he makes a virtue out of a vice, in the sense that, most cars in the automotive world are painted, but it's really hard to paint a car. One of the most expensive things in the whole car manufacturing process is the paint shop, where, you have different cars. Henry Ford always talked about, any color you want as long as they're black, in part because it's so hard to paint a car. And it's not until the 1920s that they figure out ways to really make car painting easy. And it's still very expensive. So Bricklin says, I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a virtue out of a vice. I'm going to use plastic for my cars and sheathe the car in a special kind of plastic. It's the first plastic car in the world. Later on, General Motors would use plastic on their cars. And he does this to kind of make it really innovative and futuristic. And it's pretty successful, but it has all kinds of problems. It's really hard to, get the plastic glued onto the metal of the chassis. Warps, it doesn't work. The car doors don't work that great. There's all kinds of problems, but he still manages to get into production. And by 1975, late 1975, mid 1975, he's got about 3,000 cars that have been built, which is the only time in North America between the 1940s and the Kaiser Jeep company, all the way to Elon Musk. It's the only time in North American history in about 70 years that someone builds a car and gets it into production in North America. Now, a lot of your listeners are probably going to say, well, what about the DeLorean, the famous DeLorean from the Back to the Future Back to the Future movies? That's a vehicle that everybody knows about. It was also, fantastic. Well, a lot of people don't realize that DeLoreans were built in Northern Ireland. And part of that was Malcolm Bricklin and John DeLorean both looking for cheap labor and governments that would be willing to fund their dreams. And in New Brunswick, that's where Malcolm Bricklin found his cheap labor and his government. But John DeLorean had to go all the way to Northern Ireland to do so. And Malcolm Bricklin once told me that the reason that John DeLorean ended up in Northern Ireland is because he suggested he go there, because he had been in discussion with the government of Northern Ireland as a way to kind of develop his car product. So it's a pretty fascinating story, and they get into production and they are able to build the cars. And despite getting into successful production, the cars face a lot of problems. The production is not as quick. They had imagined that they would be building, 6,000 cars a year, and then 8,000 cars a year, and 10,000 cars a year by 1976, 77, 78. But that doesn't work out. And the other side of it is, it costs a lot of money to build a car. It costs a tremendous amount of money to build a car. So today, even a gasoline-powered car to go into production, to launch a new vehicle, probably costs between $1 to $2 billion today. And you know, like Tesla, I think they were in production for about 10 years before they turned a profit, and they spent billions of dollars launching the vehicles to get there. Well, Malcolm Bricklin realizes this in 1974. It's really expensive to build and launch a vehicle. So he keeps going back to the New Brunswick government and to Richard Hatfield and saying, you know, I need some more money. This is working, but it costs a lot to make sure that we get all the quality controls up. And then we have to decide whether or not we're going to have more vehicles. So just like Elon Musk in the 2010s, he had the Tesla Roadster, and then he added, you know, the X and the S, and then the Model 3, because you got to build out a portfolio of cars so you can get more customers. And this is what Malcolm Bricklin says to the government of New Brunswick in 1975. He says, well, we've got the SV-1, the safety vehicle one going, but we need to have another car. We need to have a sedan, and then we have to have another car. And he goes back to Richard Hatfield and says, I need another $10 million because the money's not coming in fast enough because we're not building it, but we will get there eventually. And Richard Hatfield, who's already at this point politically suffering all kinds of slings and arrows because the opposition and everybody saying, look, yeah, the car is coming out, but it's costing us so much money. The car isn't as good as it could be. You know, is this going to work? Hatfield decides that it's a bridge too far, that it's too much of an ask. There's too much money going on, and he's fearful that the New Brunswick government is being taken for a ride, effectively. Even though there are cars being built, he's worried that, you know, the next, you know, they're already on the hook for 23 million by the time Bricklin asks for another 10 million, which was a lot of money for a government like New Brunswick's in the 1970s, in the early 1970s. And eventually in September of 75, Hatfield says no more money. It's not going to continue on. And because of that, the car company effectively goes into receivership. The government shuts it down. Malcolm himself goes into personal bankruptcy. The car company goes into bankruptcy. They shut it down after building about 3,000 vehicles. Now, one thing I want to mention, Ernest, is that even though they had built about 3,000 vehicles, they had back orders for thousands more vehicles. And at one point, Malcolm Bricklin in 1975 claims that they had back orders valued at about $250 million.
Wow.
So every car that the Bricklin factory pushes out the door in New Brunswick is accounted for and sold. And there's a huge number of people who are waiting for Bricklin cars. And there's a huge number of people who have put deposits down. And there's another set of people who just want to get in as dealers. So on one level, it's a pretty successful vehicle. They had the sales, it was coming along, but at the same time, it's costing way too much money. Each vehicle itself is costing way more than they expected, and they have quality problems all the way through. But Hatfield just says it's too much. We can't handle this. They pull the plug, and the company goes into receivership. It's seen as being a huge debacle for the New Brunswick government, a huge political disaster for Hatfield himself, who spends the next 10 years basically running away from the Bricklin stink, but manages to get himself reelected. His retail politics, his connections in New Brunswick, his personal charisma were so good that he was able to overcome Bricklin, but only barely, because for years he's hounded, you know, your judgment is poor, you spent all this money, and he's able to kind of punt the inquiries and the investigations into the Bricklin story until it's years off. And by the time the true numbers come out and the true problems are revealed, you know, it's faded a little bit from public memory, and Hatfield eventually is reelected a number of times, though he loses in 1987, where the party, the Progressive Conservative Party that leads, gets completely wiped out, and Frank McKenna wins every single seat in New Brunswick. But even into the late 1970s and 1980s, there are people still interested in Bricklin. The New Brunswick government fields all kinds of requests. Can we revive Bricklin? Can we take it over? There are different companies who want to do it. Individual entrepreneurs say, can you send us the plans? We'd love to continue production of the car. Because if you look at the vehicle, it's actually a pretty cool looking car. Even today, 50 years later, it holds up pretty well. And at the time, it was seen as a completely legitimate reasonable entry into the sports car market.
Yeah, in the various articles and material that I've read and seen about the history of the Bricklin, it really seems to get kind of a bad rap. I mean, there's been all these numerous comparisons to the Bricklin to the Edsel. But I've read quite a number of automotive reviews written at the time that the Bricklin came out on the market, and these reviews had positive comments about the car. I mean, it had its flaws, but was the car all that bad?
Yeah, no, it's amazing when you think about it, because Bricklin over time has kind of become a punchline, right? It's become a joke. Oh, a Bricklin is seen as, and in fact, it's got the name Bricklin in it. It's seen as, by a lot of automotive reviewers, like, in the present, it's on all kinds of lists of the 10 worst cars of all time, or the biggest mistakes in automotive history. It's compared to the Edsel, which was a gigantic flop that Ford Motor had put together that cost way more money. The Edsel was a flop that cost Ford Motor in the 1950s and 1960s hundreds of millions of dollars. The Bricklin is actually relatively small potatoes, but if you do read the reviews from Car and Driver or Mechanics or Road and Track, the reviews of the Bricklin are actually pretty positive. In fact, one of the Car and Driver cover stories in 1974 was a comparison between Bricklin and Corvette, and the title line is, which car is better, Bricklin or Corvette? And the answer may surprise you. And inside, they actually reveal that the performance of the Bricklin is better than a 1973-74 Corvette, which would shock a lot of your listeners now. But at the time, it had a great engine, had great styling, had great performance, and it's seen as a pretty good entry. And like you said, Ernest, there's a lot of problems with the vehicle in terms of some of the technology doesn't work exactly well. The gull-wing doors sometimes didn't work. Sometimes if you got caught in the rain, there would be a little bit of a flood. Sometimes the pop-up lights didn't work. The finishes were not that great. But a lot of cars at that time in the early 1970s weren't that great to begin with. I mean, this is before the Japanese have really changed the dynamic in North America, forcing the American manufacturers to build better vehicles, smaller vehicles, more fuel-efficient vehicles, better quality vehicles. So Bricklin's right on the cusp of that. And he almost, in a weird way, kind of misses out or shows up at just the wrong time. Like, he launches a sports car, a gas-guzzling sports car, the same year as the OPEC oil embargo in 1973, which, makes it pretty challenging. Even then, the car is well received, and a lot of reviewers say, "Hey, this is a great vehicle. It'll probably get better as they work out the quality problems." And that was probably one of the biggest issues. They had a lot of quality problems, and this was a consequence of the fact that they were building a new vehicle. They were building it in New Brunswick, where people didn't have a lot of experience in building cars, and they were trying to do a lot of new and innovative things around the vehicle. So there were a lot of growing pains, and the New Brunswick government wasn't patient enough to kind of make it through the growing pains. The other aspect of it was that there was a lot of, let's say, skepticism or cynicism. Malcolm Bricklin himself, as I said, he had brought a Subaru to North America in the late 1960s, but he was seen as a kind of, a lot of authors would refer to him later as the P.T. Barnum of the automotive world, where he's a little bit of a showman. It's a lot of smoke and mirrors because he's trying to convince people, buy into my car. And, he is able to launch the Bricklin, and he gets a lot of credibility in the automotive world because he manages to bring a car to fruition, which nobody had done in forever. But he's still seen as a little bit of a showman. After the Bricklin debacle goes down the tubes, a lot of people are wondering, did Malcolm Bricklin take the New Brunswick government for a ride? He always said he personally faced bankruptcy. He faced all kinds of losses. He had put all his Subaru shares into developing the vehicle. So he lost money. There's no question he lost money. But after that, Malcolm resurfaces over the next 20 or 30 years with a bunch of different ventures. He creates a different type of engine in the 1970s that's got a lot of potential, but doesn't necessarily reappear. In the 1980s, he brings a Yugo to North America. Now, Yugo is another famous failure. It's considered to be one of the worst cars of all time. It's a piece of junk that's built in the Eastern Bloc, but it's really, really cheap. And he imports them into North America. Bricklin makes a lot of money, but within a couple of years, people realize these cars are junk, and there's none of them left on the road because they simply didn't even work. They didn't have power steering, they didn't have air conditioning, they didn't have power windows, they had nothing even in the 1980s. After that, Bricklin reappears again, bringing in electric motor scooters in the 1990s. So he's got this kind of reputation as the P.T. Barnum of the automotive world. Even in the 2000s, on the one hand, he's seen as a bit of a showman, but at the same time, he's got these really pioneering, visionary ideas. He tries to bring Chinese vehicles to North America in the early 2000s. There's one of the largest car companies in China is Chery Automotive, and Bricklin makes a deal to import Chery cars, just like he had done with Subaru, just like he had done with Yugo, to sell these cars at pretty cheap and make a lot of money. And as we know, China is now the world's largest manufacturer of motor vehicles, and it's the world's largest market for motor vehicles. So Bricklin is well ahead of everybody on this curve. He ends up getting into some legal issues with Chery. The cars don't appear, but he's still very much in the game, and it's a reflective of just how impressive as an entrepreneur he is, and his willingness to take a lot of risks. His last car company, his most recent car company, is called Visionary Vehicles. And he really is a visionary in the automotive world. And I always say, if you can become famous in the automotive world, you can become pretty famous. Henry Ford, or, think about the names that we know in automotive, from Musk to Toyota to Honda to, they're all pretty famous individuals. And Bricklin becomes famous as an automotive entrepreneur. And he's so young when he does this that his fame kind of lasts for the next 50 years.
Yeah, and you going back to earlier when you mentioned there's kind of two aspects that you were looking at here. The one is the car, but one also is the appeal of the car industry. And going back to your article that you wrote called "The Quest of the Volkswagen," which is in parenthesis, you called it the Bricklin Car Industrial Modernity and New Brunswick. And so you're making the argument that the development of the auto sector through the middle part of the 20th century was the goal of industrial accomplishments for governments, for nations, and even communities. And a catalyst of what you call the dream of modernity, or that it was the catalyst. So these seem to be the concepts that Premier Hatfield led to toss his hat in the ring with Bricklin.
Absolutely. And, Hatfield uses the language of modernity, uses the language of the future when he's talking to New Brunswickers to convince them that this dream is something that's worthwhile. He basically says, we need to have faith in ourselves that we can build the cars of the future and have the technology of the future in our own province. And the Bricklin's a perfect example of that because it's seen as innovative, futuristic, forward-thinking. It's got all these aspects to it that are really high tech in the early 1970s. Now we might not see them the same way. And he proselytizes. He goes around the province saying, look, we can be just as wealthy and prosperous as Oshawa and Windsor and Oakville, which is where all the car plants were in Ontario, or Detroit, which was still seen as being kind of like the beating heart of manufacturing. We can be just as successful as Germany and Japan. These are countries that have risen out of the ashes of war and made themselves incredibly successful because the car is very much that apex of modernity. I mean, the modern world, as we understand it, really begins with the Model T and how mobility and the automobile really reshape our landscape in so many ways. And that's very much even to today. I mean, we often think about deindustrialization beginning in the 1970s and the kind of idea that the car is not really as central to our future because, tech is taking over. But if you think about it, Elon Musk is the richest man on the face of the earth because he's got a car company that is an attempt to decarbonize this industry. So it's the next generation of futurism built around automotive mobility. And Hatfield in the 1970s is very much saying that not just, we can embrace the future and we can make New Brunswick a future-looking province, one that is able to do high-tech manufacturing, assembly line manufacturing, able to kind of give the province a whole new sheen. Like in 1974, the Bricklin wins a special award from the Ontario Science Centre. It is unveiled at the Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago. It wins a special award from the plastics industry of America. So it's seen as being futuristic, innovative, technologically advanced. And Hatfield wants some of that because his province is seen as being backwards and dependent upon, extractive resource industries. It's not that great. The other thing that Hatfield says is not just, about grasping the future, it's also getting back at the naysayers. And Hatfield puts a lot of that language into his campaign speeches in the early 1970s and around 1974. He says, look, everybody in this country and everybody in North America doesn't think that New Brunswick can do it. Ottawa is giving us a hard time. They're not supporting our venture. People in Toronto and in Ontario, they're saying, oh, how can New Brunswick build cars? We build cars. They can't build cars. And this was a way for New Brunswick to really kind of get back at all the naysayers, along with reconfiguring the image of the province to one that's kind of transformed into a high-tech hub of automotive manufacturing. And he's able to sell that dream, just like Malcolm Bricklin is able to sell his dream to New Brunswick and Hatfield and to a lot of car buyers around North America. I mean, it really is this kind of encapsulation of the idea of the automobile as the essence of modernity. And it happens, Ernest, right at the moment in the early 1970s when the automobile and everything around the automobile is starting to come into question. This is the oil embargo, the beginning of deindustrialization, the beginnings of offshore competition from Japan and Germany, the beginnings of financialization in the economy where people start focusing on building products and start focusing more upon making money. It's the beginnings of automation where you start to see robotics and the Toyota production system. It's the beginnings of computerization and digitization right in the early 1970s. So Bricklin is an expression of, all of industrial modernity that's gone on since Henry Ford right until the 1970s and is about to go through an incredible collapse of deindustrialization, but then have a rebirth. I mean, the automotive industry, as we know right now, is going through a tremendous rebirth. The decarbonization and the shift toward EVs is the greatest technological upgrade in the history of humanity. And it's the automobile industry that is leading that. Now, Bricklin is a visionary who's just 40 years ahead of his time, because if he had been born 20 years later, he would have been Elon Musk.
I wonder about the difference between the development of the Tesla and the development of the Bricklin in the financing of that development of that kind of technology, because Tesla basically went the public route, whereas
no government money.
And Bricklin, that may have been the downfall.
The key difference is Malcolm Bricklin is trying to innovate in a period where technological innovation in the automobile industry is relatively stagnant. I mean, you're at the peak of the internal combustion engine's power, and there's not a lot of innovation. So he does try to innovate. He uses plastic on his car. He has gull-wing doors. He tries to innovate through safety. But technologically, the industry is nowhere near that. Whereas when Musk shows up in the early 2000s, EVs are at the cusp of practicality. And people forget that Elon Musk is not the guy who created Tesla. He appears after Tesla's been created. He takes over the company and he takes an idea that's already existing, and his genius is that he makes it happen. He shows the world that Tesla can prove that EVs can be profitable and built up to scale. But the technology has reached a critical mass in the 2000s and 2010s where he can do that. When Bricklin shows up in the early 1970s, there's no landscape where he's able to make a technological advance that's really going to change the dynamic. Musk shows up at a time where EVs are percolating up through the system. It's not just EVs. You've got hybrids, you've got hydrogen vehicles, you've got all kinds of different technological developments that are about to explode on the scene that we in 2022 are seeing the benefits of. Today in our automotive market, even with the microchip shortage and everything that's going on, 10 to 15% of new vehicles now, 10 to 15% of new vehicles now are EVs or hybrids, which is an amazing thing. Musk, in a weird way, is a lucky guy because he shows up at just the right time where he can take advantage of those technologies. And because of that, there's no need to depend on government sourcing, government funding for this. There's a lot of private investors who are willing to do this. And, it's not a coincidence that Musk launches in California, because there's so much venture capital, there's so much private capital that's willing to put into a new technology company like Tesla. So Tesla's got two advantages that Bricklin didn't have. He's got a electric vehicle, a motor that can work, and he's got digitization, everything that can be done through computer. I mean, the Tesla is basically an EV on top of an app, right? Everything right. is digital. And, Bricklin doesn't have that advantage. So Musk doesn't need to go to the government. Now, one of the things that we should keep in mind that electric vehicle technology and digitization were tremendously underpinned by government expenditures. There had been a whole host of U.S. and Canadian government funding towards EV technology in the 1990s, 2000s. Same thing with digitization. I mean, the internet, as we know, doesn't exist without government funding. So there's a kind of roundabout way, but you're absolutely right that Musk doesn't need to go to the government to get his money. Now, I'll say one thing that people don't realize. When Musk creates his new car company, or when he starts to build cars, he does so at the Fremont, California plant, which is Tesla's home plant, which had been a General Motors plant. Previously. And in fact, it had been a General Motors plant where General Motors had effectively forced Toyota to teach them how to build cars using the Toyota production system. In the 1990s and 2000s, Toyota and General Motors had a joint venture at the plant that currently builds Teslas. And they had left it because General Motors had learned how to build cars again through Toyota. They left it, it had been abandoned, and that's where Tesla jumps in. So it's interesting to see, he's actually kind of building upon the backs of previous plants and previous infrastructures. But there's no question that Musk has really changed the dynamic. I just really wish he wasn't such an idiot on other stuff like, Twitter and stuff like that. Because if he just focused on building cars, that would be better for humanity.
Yeah, he has a bit of a license to do that, doesn't he?
Well, you're the richest guy in the world, and you're changing the dynamics of humanity's relationship to fossil fuels. You have a pretty big ego and a pretty big license to do a lot of stuff. Like Henry Ford. And I always say, I know we're getting a little bit away from Bricklin right now, but I always say that Musk is in his early 20s Ford phase. So after Henry Ford's creative destruction reoriented the world because he democratized mobility through the Model T, Henry Ford kind of went through a crazy phase in the early 1920s. He buys a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, like Musk is going to buy Twitter. He gets himself into all kinds of trouble because he goes on all these kind of quixotic adventures. He tries to build a rubber plant in Brazil. He tries to reorient so much of part of Tennessee. He has all these kinds of ventures during the war. He is a pacifist. He has a peace ship. So he goes through a kind of phase where, people who are tremendously wealthy and tremendously powerful and tremendously influential go through these phases. A lot of people don't remember that Henry Ford ran for political office like Donald Trump does. Runs to become senator of Michigan and loses terribly, in part because he is, a lot of people understand that he's good at building cars and not so good at other stuff. Similar with Musk. Now, Musk is good at launching space vehicles and good at doing other stuff as well. But I think he should just stick with building cars because he's going through this crazy phase. And eventually, others will catch up to Tesla, and others will challenge Tesla's primacy in the sector. The one thing that Tesla faces, that Bricklin also faces, that he's in a landscape where there are a lot of established car manufacturers. It's really competitive. So even though Tesla's ahead of the curve on EVs, the car companies like General Motors and Toyota and Volkswagen and BMW are not sitting around. They're catching up, and it probably will catch up and in some places surpass Musk. So for instance, and I know I'm going off tangent here, but Musk doesn't have a truck. He was supposed to launch the truck, and he couldn't launch the truck. Well, this year, the Ford F-150 electric's coming out, and the Ford F-150 is the most important vehicle in North America. Ford sells 1 million of them every year, and all those Ford F-150 truck buyers are going to buy electric vehicles from Ford. They're not going to buy Tesla trucks. So he's missed a real golden opportunity there, and I wonder how that's going to affect the future of Tesla. Anyways, that's getting a little bit away of Bricklin, but Ernest, this is all connected. That's the thing. Bricklin happens dead center in that moment between the 1940s, when the automotive industry goes into this post-war, very established kind of development, all the way to the 2010s, where we start to see the revitalization of the auto industry through electric vehicles. And Bricklin kind of happens right there. He's a signpost and a symbol between Henry Ford and Elon Musk. Malcolm Bricklin and his car are right in between, and he is the kind of transition of that moment. And
he's still trying to make his mark in the automotive world. As you mentioned before, the Bricklin 3 EV, that's electric powered. So I think he still has a mission to complete.
He still has a mission to complete. He's a fascinating guy. And, I have this book coming out, hopefully by 2024, for the 50th anniversary of the launch of the Bricklin. And Mr. Bricklin, as I refer to him whenever I correspond and speak with him, is very much in the game. He said he's willing to, support the launch of my book. But he's a busy guy because he's still doing all kinds of ventures. Because he's so driven, he's so entrepreneurial, he has such a kind of zest for innovation and automobility that he's a really, even though Bricklin is kind of seen as, in retrospect, is kind of seen as, like I said, the punchline of a joke, he's an incredibly important figure in the evolution of automobility. And the fact that he's still kicking and still very much in the game is a reflection of just how determined he was to do what he did, and how determined you have to be to launch a vehicle. I mean, it's the hardest thing in all of business and entrepreneurialism. To launch a car company is the apex of business in our world. And I know a lot of people say, "Oh, what about technology? What about Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or, whomever?" Well, you can see the automobile's impact from space. You can see the automobile's impact in the sense that we're in the middle of an existential fight around greenhouse gas emissions, whose largest single contributor is the automobile and its industry. So, the automobile is so disproportionately impactful for humanity's evolution that there's a reason that these figures are larger than life. They really are giants. I mean, I always say to my students, when do you remember ever first learning about Henry Ford? And none of them can say when they did, because it almost is like osmosis. It's in our DNA. A Ford is so important to how we understand the modern world that you can't get around it. And, in the 21st century, Elon Musk will play the same role. Well, everyone knows who Elon Musk is. They don't remember when they first learned about him. They don't know how they know about him, but they know he is in our world in a way that is so tremendously impactful. That is really the essence of creative destruction and the kind of changes that an entrepreneur can bring to the world around them.
Well, Dimitry, I want to thank you for walking us through this remarkable period in automotive history and the history of a provincial government. And we'll keep our eye on Malcolm Bricklin, who, as we say at the time of this interview, he's still dabbling in this industry. So we thank you very much, Dimitry.
Well, it was my pleasure, Ernest, and I love Outrageous History. It's great. So keep at it, because this is good stuff.
And I thank all of you for tuning in to Outrageous History. Remember, for additional information about about this topic and other topics, and also information about our authors, log on to www.outrageoushistory.com. Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.